Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Awkward Silences. Today we're here with Zhou, the creator at Design Ethically. And today we're going to be talking about ethical design and ethical research. So, apropos on brand. Excited to jump in. Hot topic, important topic. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So nice to meet you two virtually.
Yeah. Still the dominant way, I suppose, these days, but we're getting more in real
Yeah.
life timing. I've
That's
got
true.
JH here too.
Yeah, this is a cool topic. Feels like a big one. My silly brain goes to like Billy Madison when they're like business ethics. It's like
Ethics.
design ethics. Yeah.
Yes. What's that guy?
So
Mm.
Bradley, whatever.
yeah, the West Wing guy or
Whitford,
whatever.
Bradley Whitford. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good one. Love it.
But yeah, I'm excited to unpack it. I think we haven't come at it from this angle before, so I think it'll be a fun conversation.
Yeah, and on that note, right? So, what are we talking about when we talk about ethical design? Because we could talk about a lot of things, and I think we will, talk about several things. But what do you think about? What are you thinking about every day in your work when you think about ethical design?
It is such a loaded term and it covers a lot. And I think it covers everything from, designing genuinely helpful and empowering, accessible products for people. It also means designing products that do not harm, manipulate, or deceive folks. It means everything from like designing things that don't exacerbate systemic inequalities too, because we all exist in this system that has a lot of unfair power differentials going on. And I think it also means that when we're looking at the practices that we're employing to design and research, right, that we're doing these things with utmost consideration and respect for people, especially marginalized communities. It also means designing that in teams that are inclusive and safe, where you feel included and safe, no matter what your background is, and you're designing on a team that is actually willing to advocate for doing the right thing over the bottom line, which is oftentimes a lot harder. Than it might seem. And yeah, I think that, I mean, fundamentally, like when we talk about research too, because this is, your bread and butter, like doing it in a way that's not exploitative, and is something, it's a way that genuinely honors the people that you're researching and is respectful.
Do you have any thoughts on like because I think we try to get this into a spot that's like pretty actionable or practical advice for people. If I'm listening to this, I'm a researcher, designer, product manager, and I'm like, we should be more ethical now we do our design work at where I'm at. Like, where do you even start? Is like you should just read about this stuff? Do you just start like in your research being more inclusive and who you talk to? Like, what's like a good like foot in the doorway to start, being a little bit more ethical in your approach to design?
Oh yeah, so I love that you mentioned reading. I think that is such a fantastic way to learn more about the world. There's so much amazing scholarship that's not necessarily like design or research scholarship, but rather literature that falls under, critical race theory or disability studies or gender studies, right? And there's so much amazing work that's been done in those realms where you get to learn about the world from a very different angle, maybe from your own. And that is such an eye-opening thing, I think, for a lot of folks that are in our, industry to read with that, to engage with that difficult those difficult topics, and to understand like when we're designing in a traditional tech company, right? It's not necessarily representative of the world, but often we're designing for a lot of people all around the world. So being mindful of those things and just getting, expanding your horizons in that regard and learning more about how your product can actually impact people from all over is really important. And I think beyond that, like as you're doing your research and stuff, just being mindful of like, when you're meeting people and talking to them, whether it's virtually or in real life, how do you kind of approach these interactions as a researcher or designer? And how do you have that respect? I think that's a word that I always go back to, is just that
Hmm.
respect. I think we do interact with so many different kinds of people from all walks of life.
Do you have any favorite resources while we're talking about books and all that sort of stuff that you would like
Oh
recommend or
man,
gift to people?
I have a whole list. So on designethically.com, there's under the toolkit section, there's a list of books,
Nice.
and they're from all different scholars. I love the works that like Ruha Benjamin has written, Race After Technology. There's also Cedric Robinson, who's done a lot of amazing work on like the intersections between, racial inequality and also socioeconomic inequality.
Mm.
And then there's Algorithms of Oppression, which is written by Dr. Safia Noble. just really fascinating stuff that makes you, really consider the industry that we're in and the workings of it and how we might be able to improve it.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great, and we'll link that and link some of those resources in the write up as well. I want to ask maybe a dumb question, but you talked about just treating people with respect, which is like sounds like a really basic thing, but I guess like what do you mean by that, right? Like you in research you hear about empathy, right? It's like been over maybe talked so much empathy that now there's the blowback to empathy and, can you ever really be empathetic and whatever. But I like this idea of respect, right? That seems like something that we could try to achieve. So what do you think about when you think about trying to treat people with respect?
Yeah, I think one thing is to kind of think about where you stand in society as a, designer coming from perhaps like an agency or a big company, right? And who you're designing for and who you might be researching. A lot of times, I think it's very easy for designers or anyone in like a tech company to, especially if they're expanding out into like an emerging market or something, a so-called emerging market, to think that, oh, we're going to come in and we're going to fix a problem. We're going to fix this thing that people are not doing right or people are struggling with. And perhaps they're not struggling with that, but like we pinpoint this, thing that we think they could be doing better. They can be living more productively, whatever that means. They can be doing things faster, and like we come in and we think we're going to help them. And it has this kind of patronizing attitude, I think, where we come in and we're like, we're going to help these people because we know better. And of course, we'll do our research, but we know better. That's like the underlying kind of mentality that isn't necessarily stated, but I think it's very much implied by the way that we work, right? And I think that's something that we have to be mindful of. And that's where the respect comes in, is just like, how do we honor these other ways of existing, of being, these other epistemologies, and not come in being like this very like savior complexy kind of persona. And so that's something that I think ties into a lot of the work that we see on decolonizing design and decolonizing research, of just realizing that there's all these nuances, right? And like, you coming into a place and doing research for the supposed benefit of the people that you're working with, like you have to sometimes question that and like really think about, is this benefiting them or is this benefiting my paycheck
Mm,
or our bottom
mm-hmm,
line?
mm-hmm.
And what are we telling ourselves and how are we approaching them? And so that's kind of what I'm referring to when I say respect.
Yeah,
Nice.
I like
I
that a
love
lot.
that kind of framing. The way you talked about it there, like the bottom line and the business part, it feels like maybe when you're doing this kind of stuff and this work in a business context, it almost becomes harder to be respectful or to treat people the way you maybe would in a different context. Do you have any thoughts on like how you balance those things of, I have this business goal or this objective that I'm responsible for, but I also want to be human and respect this person. And sometimes those things can maybe feel a little in conflict. I'm wondering if there's ways to avoid that.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I think we've traditionally talked about it as like a kind of a balancing thing. And sometimes I think there's no way to balance. I know Naomi Klein, who's the author of, she's written a lot about like the climate crisis. She makes a point in her book. The title eludes me. I think like this must change or something. We'll fact check that later. But she makes a point, which is that like sometimes, like for example, for the environmental crisis, there is no way to reconcile like the business model that we have in this capitalist system with the needs for the earth to heal and to replenish itself. And I think in some ways that can be the case in tech, right? Like we cannot design products that are addicting, and there's no way to like make a business case. I mean, you can make a business case for it, but there's no way to justify that and strike a balance. Like you're either designing addictive stuff or you're not. And so I think in that case, like what can we do? We can do what we can, right? We can start small, we can work larger, just as long as you're doing something as opposed to nothing. And so, like what I tell people is just to find an ally or an accomplice in the company and talk to them. Maybe you might be surprised that people might have the same, feeling that you do about something that could be problematic. speak up in your product team. Like when you have the chance to talk in these meetings, speak up in town halls, right? That's a great way to kind of communicate if something's not right. And then to also just abandon the urge to accept, oh, but it's always been done this way, right? So what? Like do it in a new way. It's not easy. I think that's the biggest thing. It's really difficult, especially if you are like a newer designer or researcher. It can be very hard, and it can be like a burning out situation. But sometimes if you do feel burnt out, that might be the sign to find a new place to, dedicate your talents. But it's tricky.
I love what you're saying though, because I do think there's this tendency in tech to, it's like, well, we want to have our cake and eat it too. And how can we turn this into a win-win? And how do we do ethical design and make the user happy? And like our profits are not going to suffer and everything's just going to be in perfect harmony. That's not always the case. And to your
Yeah.
point, I think like a little courage goes a long way, right? And the people who need to exert that courage are leaders, the people who can afford to. It's not fair to put that, on the sort of shoulders of people just starting out who have to prove
Exactly.
themselves and have to kind of maybe fall
Yeah.
in line a little bit more than some others do.
Yeah. And I think, I like that you brought that up because I feel like a lot of people, myself included, who have been working in this intersection of tech and design and ethics, we have spent so much time like bending over backwards trying to figure out how to reconcile business with ethics or like idealism with pragmatism, right? And it's not necessarily possible. And then like, we've seen all this like corporate social responsibility stuff and like ethics washing, which a lot of it's performative and, in the back they're actually doing stuff that's counterintuitive to what they're saying. And yeah, some things just can't be justified and need to be regulated out. And that's just the fact of the matter.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And in the long term, I do think, culture catches up a little bit and we'll see
Mhm.
if business and capitalism catch up too. But sometimes, the thought leadership of doing the right thing is a little bit ahead of the times too.
Mhm.
We'd love to unpack the like the pragmatism versus idealism thing a little bit more because I feel like whenever you're getting into a moral topic like ethics and stuff, that can kind of come with a lot of idealism. But you were also kind of describing like there are things you can just do that are better. Maybe they don't change the whole paradigm, but move something forward in your work, and you know, as a team strove to be a little bit better than you otherwise were, and that still is meaningful, right? Of like you mentioned climate change earlier, like of course regulating like the people dumping chemicals in the rivers or polluting the skies and stuff is going to have a bigger impact than anything I can do as an individual, but it doesn't make like individual actions I take meaningless either, right? Like composting stuff or doing
Mhm.
other things, still good things to do. How do you try to like square that for teams? Like it's worth doing what you can on like a local level and like maintaining the optimism that maybe you have to, it's I don't even know where I'm going with this, but does that kind of make sense?
Yes, your composting
Yeah.
matters, JH.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, it does.
That's
It
all I was
does. And
looking
I
for.
think yeah, it does matter. And I think it's just that like, if you see one person doing it, your neighbor's gonna want to do it. And then maybe the whole apartment is gonna start doing it. And I think, that's how change happens, right? And this the idea of like a spectrum of ideal versus pragmatic is something that I want to push back on a little bit because I think that dichotomy between those two can obscure the fact that some idealistic practices are just like it's just like human rights or they're just morally like right, like designing addictive technology just shouldn't be a thing. And on the flip side, more dangerously, some this kind of spectrum can obscure the fact that some pragmatic practices in our industry are just unequivocally like wrong. They're just, we just shouldn't have them. It's like child labor back in the factories and like, that's just it was wrong. And so it's something that like it comes with time and it comes with speaking up and it comes with I think this very like multi-pronged approach where people in industry like folks like you and I like who are designing are working hand in hand with policymakers and working with folks in academia to kind of formulate the new normal, to formulate what is like the new way of like what are the new standards, what is this new culture that we're shaping where it's like, and it's happening right now, which is really cool. Like last year was able to speak at the Federal Trade Commission and they're starting to crack down on regulating deceptive designs. And same at the European Union Parliament. There was a hearing this year that I spoke at where they're actually trying to draft law where, they'll start punishing companies that have this kind of deceptive, manipulative designs. And I think that's something that like is encouraging because you're seeing it actually unfold in real time. And of course, like policymaking is not perfect. There's a lot of slow bureaucracy and everything, but the ball's moving now, at least.
When you talk about deceptive design, you're talking about dark patterns, or what are we talking about?
Yes, it's really commonly known as dark patterns, and it's a term that I think the industry is kind of we're trying to phase out a bit because dark patterns, it traditionally relies on that metaphor of like dark being bad and light being good, which is kind of problematic and racist. And so
Sure.
it's also very like a nebulous term, like what does dark even mean in like for design, right?
Right.
And so we're trying to phase it out. It's tricky because deceptive is not necessarily a perfect replacement either, because there are some of those patterns that are not necessarily deceptive, but rather they're just like annoying or like
Sure.
nagging or whatever. So I think the industry is still trying to find like a good term for it, but deceptive design is at least a fragment of it that we're talking about.
As an example to maybe make this tangible for folks, like something that maybe doesn't feel deceptive, but also feels like not a good ethical design is like, like excessive notifications or something like that, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of straight down
Yep.
the middle what it is, but it's like maybe not to anyone's benefit to like over notify or something. Would that be it, or
Exactly.
other examples?
That's a great example. Another example is those kind of like petty, passive aggressive
I
like
hate those
copy
so
that you
much. I
see
know
Oh,
what
like
you're
no, I
talking
want to
about.
pay full
I
price or
don't want
whatever.
to
Those
save
guys,
money
Yeah,
today.
I
like
fucking hate those. Yeah,
Those are the
it's
worst.
so annoying,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
so
So that's an
annoying.
example of that.
I always
And then
say I
like,
don't want
uh,
that. I'm just say I have to.
yeah,
Get away from me. I don't want it.
like
No.
whose job is it to write that?
And obviously it's effective because 10
That's what I
years
was gonna say.
later
It
it's
probably
still
works, right? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah,
it does.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's another great example of them.
Yeah, so that is a good one. So if you're maybe just to play this out a little, like I'm a designer on an e-commerce site or something, and somebody's running an A/B test, and they saw that we get way more conversion lift when we phrase it that way,
Hmm.
but you think it's like not right, or you think it's wrong, or just obnoxious. What do you do? Like, do you try to just work really hard to figure out an ethical version that outperforms it, or do you just have to take like a line in the sand, like we're not going to like profit that way, or like because I think to your point earlier about like
Oh.
leaders versus ICs, Aaron, it's like not something that an individual designer is probably going to be empowered to make that kind of call, or you just have to wait for the regulation to come and to be like you can't write an obnoxious copy. Like that feels like a hard one to to regulate in some
Yeah.
ways, but
Yeah, it's actually you're spot on. It's very tricky to regulate because a lot of these patterns they shift, they like change, especially with different kinds of technology as well. And I think, also for like designers, I actually don't know that it is necessarily always designers that are writing these things either. It could
true.
also very much well be like marketers and
Sounds
whatnot.
like a marketer.
It does sound like
Right?
a marketer.
Yeah.
It really could. And I can see like, something that I talk about a lot is just how like the chain of command or like the ways of working in these tech companies where it's like, likely a designer or a marketer or whomever is reporting to their boss or their team, and they have certain, you know, metrics or OKRs that they're trying to fulfill, and like they're like grasping at anything. Like what can I do to make sure that, this click through rate or whatever for this one button goes up so I can show that I've made impact and get a promotion. And so it's like that's kind of like how these practices are motivated and like incentivized. It's not always is it like a manager at a company saying you have to lie or like put a
Right.
deceptive thing here, but it's just like you gotta boost up engagement, otherwise your job could be on the line or whatever. And then we look around and we see what practices can we use, and it just so happens that these things are unfortunately super effective, which is not great. And so that's why, yeah, regulation has to happen, and also like education, right? We a lot of these practices that we use are taught in boot camps or schools or whatnot. Like the whole idea of like getting users hooked, that's been taught in design schooling for a while. And so how can we kind of you know turn away from that kind of school of thought and then really think about how can we be respectful to our users and not be annoying. I think that's just another thing, like just can we not be annoying to people and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
think about like we're designing for people like ourselves and for others and whatnot, like
On the hooked thing, like because I feel like you hear examples too that are more positive, and maybe they're a little like paternalistic or something. I don't know how to describe
yeah.
it bestly, but like a classic example that comes up is with like toothpaste. People weren't brushing their teeth a lot, and then Colgate or whoever put mint in it, and then it had this refreshing feel, and it made it more of a habit thing, and a lot of people adopted it. And in some ways, that seems like probably a good thing, like probably good to for tooth health or hygiene or whatever. I'm not a dentist. I don't know for sure, but like that seems like it comes from a place of better intent than like let's get them coming
Mhm.
to our app all the time, and like that even feels very fuzzy. So like where who gets to determine like this is okay, like behavior change, and this is like something that's pushing it in a bad direction. Like that feels very fuzzy.
I think consent is something that is a
Hmm.
really key thing here. So, like with the toothpaste example, or any of the examples where it's like banks that or and not banks, but it was like government programs that try to like bump up pension rates. Nudging people to get their pension started and sorted out. Like it's one of those things where these people that are the intended users, they're not like being lied to or anything. Like they know what they're getting themselves into. They know that they're buying toothpaste. Whereas like with more of the deceptive stuff, it's like you're trying to deceive people or nudge people into paying more money, and that's not always something that we might necessarily consent to if we have like the full knowledge of what's happening, right? And some things it's like, are we acting in the user's best interest? Are we acting in the company's interest? Like you have to kind of figure that out. And it's oftentimes it can be gray, but sometimes things just feel right versus feel wrong.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah, listen to
nudging
that
people to,
feeling. Yeah.
yeah, that gut feeling. And I think it's something like there's probably a philosophical term out there for it that sums up, that intuition that we have, but some
Mhm.
things just don't feel right.
Yeah, I can imagine too within companies that this is just going to vary situation by situation. I'm thinking
Hmm.
of an experience early in my career, was working in e-commerce site and role, and a marketer, a junior marketer, sent out an email with like a very provocative subject line, like a clickbait through the max of like, check out what you did last night,
Mm.
or who knows, something like that, right? And it got a ton of great click through and all this sort of stuff. But the CMO like got wind of it and came in and was like, we're not like shut this down. Like this is not going to happen.
Yeah.
Like this is a bad
Yeah.
email. We're going to get spam, et cetera. Right? There's gonna be
Yeah.
long term effects of this that are not good for the business, and
Mhm.
we're going to say no. But at the time, we were also running all these like free campaigns where the thing was free, but then you had a bunch of cross sells and you're going to pay a lot for shipping, so the company makes money. And it's like, is that a good thing or not? I don't know. But like, but so even within that, it was very multifaceted in that role where there's certain things like I think the right decision was made. Other things you could argue were a little bit more deceptive. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is just complicated. Like I'd imagine that happens in any business. There's so many decisions being made, and there's so many different factors of how you keep users engaged that some are going to probably feel clearly over the line, and some are a little bit more, in the middle.
And that's
So
why I think it's important for like, companies. It's important for designers or researchers within companies to kind of really identify the way that they're working and also to consult like the existing research that's out there of what's okay and what's not okay. There's been a lot of like scholarship around doing ethical research. That's not just necessarily in like the design sphere, but also coming from like other industries that have been doing research as well, like medicine, right? Anything working with children and educate, like that kind of stuff. So there's practices that we can borrow from when we think about what's okay and what's not okay.
before we talked a little bit about, respecting the audience you're trying to serve, right? So even in the almost 5 years I've worked at user interviews, you see these conversations start to shift in their maturity in terms of where we are with ethical research, with accessibility, inclusion, with does a company need user research, with all sorts of things. And so it feels like we're at a stage where people inclusive representation is something people, I think they're pretty aware of it, that's something they should do, it's an imperative. But you were talking about like, let's not do that in a way that is sort of like condescending or presupposes we know the best way to help a population without actually objectively researching that. So love to just dig a little bit more into inclusive representation and how
Mm,
to do it ethically. Like once we've
mm,
established we should do it, how do we do it ethically across internal teams, working with participants and research throughout our design
mm.
process and so on.
Yeah, this is a great point, and I'm glad you brought this up again because I think inclusive representation. There's two parts to it. There's two sides to it. I mean,
Mm,
so one side is the side that we commonly know about, like how are you making sure that you're engaging with communities that span various like racial, socioeconomic, gender differences, thinking about, disability and sexual orientation, etc. That's a huge part. And then I think another side to it, the other part of it is also making sure that we're not being inclusive just so we can be inclusive, but while we're still designing a product that's like very problematic. And what
right.
I mean by that is like, I think Ruha Benjamin does amazing work talking about how like for example, surveillance tools and predictive policing
Sure.
tools. Sure, you can be inclusive and include like Black folks in your research, but at the end of the day, the tool that you're designing is meant to prey on these communities.
Right.
So it's like overall, if you zoom out, like you're realizing, oh wow, like sure I'm being inclusive, but my end goal of putting this product out there is like there's a lot of harm that's embedded in that product.
So
I
it
think
feels
it's
like
important.
the first filter there, maybe for a designer, is like choose who you work for wisely, right? There's only so much you can do if the product itself is
Exactly.
right. I mean, if you have an ad supported social media platform, like, maybe you're going to have
Yeah.
problems with addiction unless, how that sort of
Yeah.
work changes. But I hear you
Exactly. Like,
a little bit, right? Like,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like, you can work for like a diet, like tummy tea, one of those things, and be inclusive with how you market it. But like at the end of the day, it's still championing a really problematic product. And so
Mm-hmm.
just reflecting on like what your product is doing and how it exists in the system in which we live. Who does it help, right? And who does it hurt? And then be like doing that first check and then moving into the actual like thinking about inclusivity when you're doing your research,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how you can be empowering in your research practices as opposed to exploitative, right? And thinking about that difference.
Does it ever just like translate or evolve into, maybe it started as a like performative check the box thing, like let's get a more, diverse group of participants for this research, even though, they don't maybe have the intent or well-meaning behind it. But just by the exposure, does it ever like trend in a more positive direction of like, well, I heard a little something from that person that actually did stick with me. Maybe I still made in the short term a decision I would have made anyways, but like opened the door a crack, or is it needs to be like coming from a more heartfelt place from the start or better intention. Does that make any sense?
If I'm understanding you correctly, is it like that people can kind of almost accidentally stumble upon?
Yeah, does it help like change your worldview a little bit in ways, even if you didn't go into it with that intent, right? So like I'm just imagining like
Mm,
I'm gonna do some like on location research because we're gonna open a store in some different neighborhood that I'm not usually in.
mhm,
And you're going
mhm.
there as maybe a performative thing to check the box, or whatever. But by like over time, by spending some time in that neighborhood, you probably are going to pick up some things and internalize some things that are hopefully like nudging you in a better direction and better well-meaning. Or is that like, does that not happen? I guess I actually don't know.
I think it could happen. I think, of course, there's also probably chances, depending on who it is, they could come out of that not realizing it either. But I would hope that would happen. I would hope that, as a researcher or a designer, you kind of have this openness and this awareness, self-awareness, to kind of be able to observe and understand and be open to things that are like different ways of being, of existing. And that's something that like is a tool that or is a skill that we hone over the course of our lifetimes. It's not something we're necessarily born with.
How long have you been thinking about ethical design and research?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it's been for the bulk of my career. I think when I
Mm-hmm.
came into the tech industry, I came in with this like, very dear like very the rose tinted glasses, right? Thinking
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
we were gonna change the world for the better. And like there's that episode in Silicon Valley where it's like they're all at this like tech conference or the tech crunch thing or whatever, and everyone's like, we're gonna revolutionize the world with this yada 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 app.
Right.
And I think I came
Music
in with that.
compression. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And then it was just like headline after headline of how certain companies that perhaps like, we'd looked up to in the past were just doing horrible things. And this was I think that was an eye-opening moment for me, even though historically you've seen that a lot, right, with other industries as well, not just tech. But it was really disappointing, and I think it was also very annoying too, or frustrating, because we would hear countless executives saying, "I'm sorry, like we need ethics," but then like, what did that even mean? What does that
Mm.
mean to have ethics? And it, of course, was talking the talk, but how could we as designers like actively intervene in our ways of working, or at least like change the ways that we work to better reflect on this stuff? And I think it's really easy, in when you're in a product team, to get super excited about what you're designing, and everyone's like, really positive and just like enthusiastic, and then it's really easy to kind of like forget to consider what could go wrong. And I've noticed when I give my workshops, though, because I've already primed people to think about this stuff, when they're actually like diving into the activities, like they typically think about a lot of the what could go wrong aspects, like way more than they would think about what benefits does this product bring,
Mm.
right? But when you're like in a team, that you're having fun with people, like designing a fun thing, it's hard to kind of like flip that switch in your head because no one's priming you there.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Mm-hmm.
kind of have to like prime yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of different tools out there. There's a lot of scholarship out there to kind of get you to think about that, which goes back to the reading part of like,
Mm-hmm.
getting aware about what's going on. And it's good to keep yourself informed in that way.
Yeah. I feel like what's really funny is like all those tropes of like we're changing the world over. A lot of times it just is left like unsaid. They don't even say like for the better. It's like we're just changing the world. It's like in
Yeah,
what
we're just
direction?
changing
Like
the world.
yeah,
Can't argue with that. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like true, but it would be nice to
Yeah.
know. It's yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess you said you kind of started with like rose tinted glasses or what, like what 10 are they now? Or like, what are you feeling optimistic about, pessimistic about, what's
Mhm.
the future look like?
Yeah. One of those things where I think in some ways there's a lot to be pessimistic about, but ultimately I do have hope. I think otherwise like how like there's no way you can stay in this industry or any industry if you don't have some hope that you can like there can be some change. But I do think it needs to come from regulation. I think that
Mm-hmm.
like companies today in this system, they operate based on incentives and they're always doing these cost benefit analyses of what can we get away with, what fines can we
Mm-hmm.
pay out and like be okay. And I think at the end of the day, we do need to have like some more stringent rulings around how companies are able to behave and how
Mm-hmm.
design practitioners, technologists, etc., can act. And this is something that it's not going to be easy, but I think there are lots of different perspectives we can bring into the room when it comes to crafting that kind of legislation. And it's starting to happen, and I think it's going to start happening more and more.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. I'm, my politics support
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm with you.
Mm.
Like regulation, like corporate greed, people will not do the right thing because it's the right thing. And corporations are people, according to the Supreme Court. But so a question, what about the user experience of regulation, right? So you think about these
Mm-hmm.
laws come
Yep.
down, they are long, they are
Yep.
hard to understand, they're hard to execute on. And, you know, they're very easy for large corporations to hire a bunch of lawyers to
Mm-hmm.
read and follow the letter of the law. And that's not a bad outcome, right? Effective that is good for these companies causing the most harm. They no longer, at least hopefully, if the regulations are good, are able to do that. But it can be very hard for smaller companies who, maybe are trying to do the right thing to spend all their time working with regulations. What do you think about that trade-off?
It's such a good point that you brought that up. It's something that like it's incredibly frustrating when you realize that the mechanisms in the system can be very slow moving and inefficient. And I was on a panel and with a federal trade commissioner who was talking about like what we could do from a regulatory standpoint to like crack down on deceptive designs. And they were talking about loopholes, like how can we go, find a loophole to like ensure that this gets passed through. And like, it's kind of wild when you think about how like we can't just make a law that says this. Like we have to like go through all these twists and turns. And I think that kind of goes to the conversation point about like reform versus like revolution. And like,
Mm,
well, when you hear the word revolution, that can definitely be a very provocative word in some ways. But I think sometimes like we do need to kind of think about these things, like just like with the climate crisis, like we can't go on the way that we're going on. Something has to give and something has to change. It's either going to be like the environment or us. And with tech, like it's either going to be the tech companies or like our mental health and like our safety and our privacy, etc. And so I think that's why regulation, when paired with like the community organizing that's been happening in tech, the amount of unions that have been popping up within our
mhm,
industry in the last like decade or so, or even 5 years, I dare to say, like
mhm, mhm,
it's incredible. It's I think that's something that is going to play a huge role in like, the kind of momentum behind like university students like boycotting Palantir, for example. That's
mhm,
something that's really important. Like having that kind of discourse around like where do we draw the line as designers or engineers or whatnot? Like, what is our stance, and like, how can we refuse? And I think that when you bring in that kind of holistic approach
Mm-hmm.
from regulation, from us as individual actors, but also community movements, that can be very powerful. So that's why I'm optimistic. It's hard to be optimistic, but I'm lightly optimistic that stuff is happening. Yeah.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
arc of history is long and all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the regulation thing I think is really tough, right? Because your point, it's hard to craft good regulation that actually like is surgical enough to address the issue and get it passed, let alone. But then it also, in a lot of cases, has this unintended effect of benefiting the large incumbents because they have the lawyers and the resources to deal with the regulation and actually can stifle some of the
Hmm.
newer entrants that are maybe more well-meaning or progressive in some of these things. So it's really tough. The other way I think you see it solved in some cases, or not solved, but positive movement is like through public funding of better alternatives and stuff, right? So like to go to the climate crisis one, a lot of that initial like research money and everything else into solar and stuff like that helps kickstart that industry. And at some point, fingers crossed, it's just going to be the cheaper power option. And so companies that use a ton of power are not going to choose it because it's like the moral thing. They're just gonna be like, well, this is the cheapest way to get electricity, and we use a ton of electricity. And so you kind of tip it over that way. Like, are there things that in the public sphere that could go that way of like, whether it's education or things like that, that can maybe also like help here?
I think one of the things that comes to mind is just the culture of open source technology. I think that is something that I have a lot of hope in. And I've worked in open source in the past in my last company. Like, the idea that we can build a product that's for people by people. And one of my favorite apps that I use for messaging, Signal, is an
Mhm.
open source product. And I think
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of potential there. And if, we can kind of shift it back into the commons, right? That's something that's very promising. And, having something like an open source technology that of course has to be vetted for like security and whatnot, but having that, power a lot of these functions that are increasingly being outsourced to private tech companies when they really shouldn't be, could be a potential turning point, especially when we were thinking about how like a lot of healthcare things are now being shuttled off to private tech companies. And that
Mm-hmm.
was a crisis. That was a huge ordeal during the pandemic, which is still ongoing.
Right.
But like, we saw like in the UK, there was lots of problems with like privacy issues and whatnot when they used all those privatized contact
Yeah.
tracing companies. So I
Right.
think going back to open source is something that we have to do and we have to invest in. And I think that's also, it's cool because it encourages a culture of like building together.
Yeah.
When I was working on that open source product, like, it was honestly a shocking, it was amazing to see like just people from all different time zones all over the world, like willingly contributing their time to this. And of course we'd have to figure out ways to like, compensate people, but like, together building something for like a greater good was really cool. So
I feel
yeah.
like this is our in to dive into the blockchain. I know it. I can feel it. I know. It just makes me think we haven't even done an episode on blockchain
Yeah, yeah.
anything.
Web3.
Yeah.
Maybe a real tangible example because I feel like you might know more about this than I do. But like the regulation around the like cookie consent stuff, and you have all those pop-ups now of like yes and
Yeah.
like
Yep.
have those
Hmm.
helped anyone, or is that like a well-meaning thing that just has like not done anything, or
It
what's like kind of your take on
exactly.
that?
So it's interesting because it's been talked about in Europe. So where I live right now, everywhere you go, every website you go to has a cookie banner, and that has in some ways inadvertently or accidentally led to other deceptive patterns where like, or manipulative patterns where companies who have to have this banner, right,
Oh,
they'll make it so that you have to like individually like uncheck every single like box if you want to opt out of that. And
and
of
they just
course
throw
most
other
people
stuff
don't
in
have the
there.
time,
Yeah,
exactly, and so they have lists of that, and people would typically just accept the default, which is like they'll accept the cookies. So there's been problems with that. And I think it's one of those things where like it goes back to like the difficulties of crafting that kind of legislation that encompasses all those different potential loopholes. And there's a lot of people are creative. There's a lot of loopholes, and I think it's one of those things where it's being addressed right now. People like there's like organizations addressing how they can redesign the cookie like design, the cookie banner, and like redesign that policy. And it's something that like when we are considering regulating other technological phenomenons that are annoying, we have to be just mindful of this past incident.
Right. There's a lot of
Yeah.
unintended consequences that come out of these things.
Yeah.
I definitely recommend the Chrome extension to block all the cookie blockers. It's the best
What?
extension.
Okay.
And because I don't have it for mobile, which I should see if I can find it, but it has
Yeah.
made my
I
life
know
so
there's
much
one for
better. Yeah.
Safari too that probably good for mobile.
Yeah.
I think it's called like Stop the Madness or something. That
Yeah.
just like blocks
Yeah.
all those things.
It's
Or
great.
auto accepts
Oh.
them or whatever
Yeah.
it is. Yeah. Not a great solution probably in other
Hmm.
ways, but
Yeah. Works for me. All right. Well, leave us on a, well, you don't have to leave us on a good note. You can choose the tone as you like, but what's the one thing or a one thing, you'd like people to take away when they're thinking about ethical design?
I think kind of going back to that, what I was saying about the optimistic part, like,
Mhm.
you know, it can be hard to be optimistic, but like find your allies, find your accomplices, find people that, you know, want to support you and can validate and stand by what you feel. If something's going wrong, like they can be there in solidarity. I think that's incredibly important.
Mhm.
And we've seen this in like where in companies that have been problematic, like the kind of organizing that employees can do is very powerful. So I think that is good. And like also just like as a designer or researcher, looking out for your mental health is super important. You know, we're still in a pandemic, like it's as we were saying in the beginning, like this is still happening and this work is hard. It's hard work. And so looking out for yourself and like taking care of yourself and your soul and that kind of like nourishing yourself in that way and is really important. And sometimes like if things are rough or difficult and you find yourself in a difficult like pickle at a company or something, knowing that there's other alternatives out there, that there are other options, and finding that community to back you up is good.
Mhm. Mhm. Awesome. Yeah, and I'm looking. It looks like you have some resources on your website for finding communities that way as well.
there's so many small steps we can take forward. I think that was something you said earlier that really stuck with me of just progress is good. So doing little things along the way do add up to bigger changes down the road. So there's things that people can,
Yeah,
pull in and are worth doing.
exactly. And I think people like at the end of the day, no one necessarily wants to be like the bad person. Like I think
Yeah.
everyone's no one wants to be a villain. Hopefully not. And I think it's just a matter of like figuring out how to get the ball rolling when it comes to change. And sometimes it means like changing the configuration of incentives that's
Mhm.
currently in place. And yeah, looking at all of that nitty gritty detailed stuff, which is a lot, but very worth it.
Cool.
Thank you so much for joining us today. You've been a great guest and given us all a lot of great stuff to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, likewise. Excited to
All
check out all these
right.
resources. So take care.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.